Welcome, Levies, to something that's a little bit different today. Today, we'll be talking about Anvil Empires and why I believe the developers at Siege Camp are expanding in this new game's direction at the time that they are. Now, this is going to be a little bit off script. I do actually have a script I'm working with, however, I'm also rearranging it on the fly. So forgive me if it's a little scatterbrained, but I promise it'll make sense. Okay, anyone who doesn't follow my channel regularly, who am I? I Saw a Bear. For the last close to 6 years, I've been covering the development and the updates while also playing a fair bit of a MMO called Foxhole. If you're unfamiliar with it, a quick breakdown is that it is a World War I, World War II style top-down shooter that is an MMO where all players on either side of two factions have to work together in order to mine resources, to produce war materials, to transport them to the front, and then fight it out to take over territory. Whoever takes over enough territory wins after a certain amount of time, and these matches, or wars, can take anywhere from a few weeks to upwards of well over a month. And this simulated war economy really does lend itself to a grand strategy war game played by a lot of people, because since people are mining resources and transporting them to the front, that gives opportunity for raiders and ambushing, in addition to things like vehicle combat, artillery crews, medical gameplay, frontline combat, backline, RuneScape wannabes, that kind of thing. The world and the economy is really unlike any other game out there. So now you're wondering, what the heck is Anvil Empires? Well, Anvil Empires is going to be a lot of the same thing. In fact, let's take it from the developers themselves. Quote, "I've always dreamed of a game that would allow players to come up with their own narratives by collaborating with others on a massive scale, and doing so in an environment where the stakes felt real. I'm talking about a game where you could band together with other players, plan a strategy that takes weeks to unfold, and use it to change the tide of a large-scale war." Now, in Foxhole's case, it was shells, tanks, bayonets, but in Anvil Empires, you're switching it out for swords, grain, and horses, I guess. Although it looks to be attempting to be bigger and better than Foxhole. But this begs the question, why? Why now? Why not just focus on Foxhole? Why are they developing a new game while they still have another game that is doing well enough, but also still needs updates, still needs improvements in certain areas? As someone who's been following Foxhole, and not only that, but keeping track of its development update history, I don't have any insider information that would allow me to tell you exactly what the developers are thinking, but I like to think that my history of covering the game does lend itself to being able to somewhat take some educated guesses as to why they're doing this. Some of the information I'll be bringing up has been explicitly mentioned by the devs. Other information is sort of what I've gleaned from the updates over these years. So why? Why would they be working on another game? It's important to note that there are two teams, one that's dedicated towards working on Anvil Empires, and one that's dedicated towards working on Foxhole. However, they will share resources from time to time. Just as an example, Foxhole releases a new tank. There was a concept artist who made the design for that tank. But if they're not developing any new tanks, that concept artist can go work on Anvil Empires drawing fortifications or something. There's shared resources. You don't need all the team members on a team at any given time. You can trade those resources. So for all the people who like to say, oh, the game's terrible because they're just shifting everyone towards Anvil, that's not how that works. Let's start with the economic perspective. Obviously, games these days are a lot different from games in the 90s and the early 2000s, but typically, a game will sell its most copies in and around its release and other major updates. Now, while Foxhole is being worked on, and as the developers claimed, will be worked on for the next couple of years, at this point, the 1.0 launch of Foxhole is behind us. Now, any number of things can happen between now and a few years from now, so I'm not going to pretend to predict what the sales records for Foxhole will be in the future. But from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense to put all of your eggs into one basket. As the saying goes, if you drop that basket, all your eggs get cracked. By having a different team develop a new game, not only will Foxhole help to provide the funding for that future project, but it will also guarantee some sort of future income for Siege Camp as a company going forward, instead of, Foxhole dying down, as an example, and then them just not having any income to go off of. And that's not just for game development. I work in ecology, and it's not like we only do one project at a time. We're constantly looking for new projects. Okay, but that's just the business side of things. What about the game side of things? I think this is where covering the Foxhole updates over the years will have its biggest help. Foxhole is built on the Unreal 4 engine. This engine was never intended to develop large-scale MMOs, but somehow Siege Camp made it work. And made it work pretty damn well, all things considered. But there is an upper limit to what they can do inside of this engine. The player count in Foxhole has not surpassed 120 players per side in a region for years now, and the Vivox voice chat cannot keep up with more than those numbers. In fact, if you go back through the patch notes, a lot of the design decisions in Foxhole have been tied to player number limits. The regions are a certain size because of player limits. The devs suggested the only way to increase the amount of players on a single war is to either add more regions or subdivide current regions. It's not only that either. Stuff like border bases. They spawn with a crap ton of supplies to give players attacking across a border a much higher chance of setting up a base so that fights can happen more readily, and so that one side doesn't just get border camped. This isn't a gameplay feature that devs wanted to add, but they had to in order to force those borders and those front lines to actually move. There's plenty of other design choices that you can find throughout Foxhole like these. I'm just giving these as examples. But I think Foxhole has exceeded the devs' expectations, and naturally the only way forward was to develop something from the ground up that was even bigger and, hopefully, even better. This is where Anvil Empires comes in. They've built their own game engine. There was, a few years ago, the Red River tech demo. It was a test of 1,000 versus 1,000 players on this one single little map. It was set in the Foxhole universe, but it was made clear that this was a tech demo for a future game, and that game is Anvil Empires. Just from these points alone, it's clear that the player count has been the biggest thing holding back Siege Camp from creating more massive worlds, and I think their own engine, with their own rules, their own mechanics, is going to help with that. The other reason they'd probably like to push out Anvil Empires into its alpha and maybe its beta phase while Foxhole is still running is despite the fact that some players might switch over and Foxhole might become more or less popular over time, is that Foxhole still gives a good ground for experimentation and testing of certain mechanics before implementing them into Anvil Empires. I know some people might shudder at the idea of using one game as a testing ground for another game, but experience can only be built up in one way, and that's to experience it. That goes the same for players, but also for the developers, who, if they want to build something new and see how it works with hundreds or thousands of people using it, they already have a testing ground. And I imagine the Naval update for Foxhole that's scheduled to come out sometime this year, at least at time of recording, is probably going to be a really big tech test for any naval assets that get added to Anvil Empires. I'm willing to bet on that. And I mean, if anything was going to convince you that Anvil Empires was always the next step in their plan, just look at their logo. They switched their name to Siege Camp, and their logo is of a trebuchet. I mean, it sounds cool, but also medieval and all that. I also imagine that for the development process of Anvil, it's much simpler in terms of balancing. In Foxhole, they have to balance dozens of tanks, ammo calibers, distances, ranges, all that stuff. I don't think you have to play with as many numbers when you're dealing with swords, spears, and a couple of bows and arrows. Although they could do some really crazy stuff when it comes to the siege works if they really wanted to. I guess the only question that really remains for me is, what will I be doing? I've covered Foxhole for almost 6 years. It'll be 6 years this fall. Am I going to be covering Anvil Empires the same way? Well, honestly, I don't know. I've loved Foxhole as a game for all of these years, and it really has been a crazy ride to have been covering it for this long. especially when I made that pre-alpha development video to 1.0. It was an hour long of some of the biggest changes that have happened to the game, and it really put all of the work, not only on the developers, but on my end, into perspective. Believe me, I've enjoyed the ride this whole time, but embarking on a new journey like that from the start, well, that's a tall task to ask. But who knows? Just can't keep myself from working, so maybe, just maybe, I'll keep going forward with it. But I'll definitely keep covering the Foxhole updates. There's also the issue of, a medieval game versus a World War I, World War II style game. Just because both share similar mechanics and similar gameplay doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to be attracted to both. I personally love the setting for Foxhole. I like the World War I, World War II style era games. I think the artillery's super awesome in it. I don't know if I'd get the same thing from firing a trebuchet. Don't get me wrong, I'll definitely play Anvil Empires and I'll definitely enjoy it. I just don't know if I'll have the same level of attachment to its world and its technology as I would the World War I, World War II style stuff. But I want to know what you guys think. Is now the right time to be launching the alpha for Anvil Empires? Do you think there's still too much left in Foxhole that the devs will have to add or fix? Or do you think now is the right time to be laying a new foundation? Let me know in the comments down below. It might end up being the case that Foxhole was the game that had to walk so that Anvil could run, but it also might be the case that Foxhole is the foundation that will anchor Anvil in place and allow it to raise its flag up high. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching this vid. Like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date on all the latest Foxhole updates, and potentially the Anvil ones. And as always, good luck, sharpen your swords, and stay in your citadels. Bear, out.